July 26, 1942. Somewhere in the Egyptian desert, 50 miles behind Axis lines, 18 small vehicles sit motionless in the darkness, their engines cold, their crews waiting. They are British Special Air Service commandos, and they are about to attempt something that has never been done before. At precisely 0100 hours, runway lights flicker to life at Sidi Hainish Airfield. A German bomber is coming in to land. Major David Sterling fires a green flare into the night sky. The signal means go. The vehicles surge forward in a V formation, their Vickers K machine guns already blazing. Tracer rounds rip through Park Junkers transport planes and Messerschmitt fighters. Fuel tanks explode. Ammunition cooks off in brilliant cascades of fire. In less than 15 minutes, 37 Axis aircraft are destroyed or damaged on the ground. 2 Allied soldiers would lose their lives in this operation. Lance Bombardier Gene Robson, age 21, was killed during the raid itself. French SAS paratrooper André Zernheld was fatally wounded by Stuka dive bombers during the harrowing withdrawal across the desert. 3 vehicles were lost. The vehicles that made this impossible raid possible were not British. They were not built for desert warfare. They were not even designed for combat. They were American Jeeps, quarter-ton trucks created for reconnaissance, and they had just changed the nature of special operations warfare forever. This is the story of how the American Jeep did what no German vehicle could in every theater of the Second World War. It is a story of desperate deadlines and inspired engineering. It is a story of a vehicle that generals called indispensable and enemy soldiers believed was issued to every American soldier. It is a story of how democratic industrial power overwhelmed specialized German excellence through sheer numbers and radical versatility. The Willis MB Jeep stands as perhaps the most consequential military vehicle ever built. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced roughly 640,000 of them. General George Marshall, the United States Army Chief of Staff, called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. General Dwight Eisenhower listed it among the 4 pieces of equipment most vital to Allied success in Africa and Europe. The Jeep did not merely support the war effort. It enabled the mechanized, fast-moving style of warfare that ultimately overwhelmed the Axis powers. To understand why the Jeep mattered, we must first understand what Germany did not have. The Wehrmacht operated over 100 different vehicle designs during the war, creating a logistics nightmare of incompatible parts, specialized maintenance, and competing supply chains. When German planners attempted to standardize their light vehicles in the 1930s, the program failed spectacularly. Their requirements were too complex. No manufacturer could build the vehicles in sufficient numbers at acceptable cost. The program was called Einheitsbkw, meaning standardized passenger car. It was launched in 1934 with ambitious goals. 5 types of standardized military vehicles would replace the chaotic mix of civilian cars pressed into military service. Multiple manufacturers would cooperate to produce uniform chassis and mechanicals. The result would be simple logistics, easy maintenance, and streamlined training. The reality was disastrous. The program demanded not only independent suspension but also 4-wheel steering, leading to overly complex designs. No single German manufacturer could supply the required numbers alone. Several companies were charged with production, but each outsourced components to different third-party suppliers. Each used engines from its own civilian line, so even the engines were not standardized. The Wehrmacht still had to source 60% of their vehicle requirements elsewhere, converting civilian cars to military use. The Einheitsbkw program never came close to achieving its goals. The closest German equivalent to the Jeep was the Volkswagen Kübelwagen Type 82. Ferdinand Porsche's team designed it using the air-cooled flat-4 engine from the Volkswagen Beetle. It produced just 23 to 25 horsepower, less than half what the American Jeep delivered. More critically, it had only rear-wheel drive. No matter how clever its engineering, no matter how smooth its underbody for sliding over sand, no matter how high its ground clearance, it could not match a vehicle with power to all 4 wheels. Germany built only 50,435 Kübelwagens during the entire war. The Americans built more than 12 times that number of Jeeps. But in July of 1940, none of this had happened yet. The Jeep did not exist. The vehicle that would win a war had not been invented, and the United States Army was about to issue the most demanding automotive challenge in history. On July 11, 1940, the Army Quartermaster Corps sent specifications for a new light reconnaissance vehicle to 135 American automotive manufacturers. The requirements seemed impossible. The vehicle needed four-wheel drive, a three-man crew, a wheelbase no longer than 75 in, ground clearance of at least 6 1/4 in, and an empty weight of just 1,275 pounds. Companies had 11 days to submit bids. Of 135 manufacturers contacted, only 2 responded. American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania was a near-bankrupt firm with roughly 15 workers remaining. Willis Overland Motors of Toledo, Ohio submitted a bid but requested 75 extra days to build a prototype. Ford Motor Company entered later after direct government solicitation. Bantam was the only company to submit complete blueprints by the July 22 deadline, but Bantam had no engineer capable of designing the vehicle. In desperation, they called Carl Probst, a freelance automotive engineer from Detroit. Probst initially refused. He was busy with other work. But when the Army itself called and explained the urgent need, Probst relented. He arrived at Bantam's empty drafting room on July 18, 1940, with just 4 days before bids were due. Working through the weekend without sleep, Probst drafted the complete design in approximately 2 days. His calculations showed the vehicle would weigh 1,850 pounds, far over the Army's limit of 1,275, so he optimistically marked it at 1,300 and hoped for the best. The hand-built prototype, nicknamed the Blitz Buggy, was driven from Butler to Camp Holabird in Maryland. It arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon on September 23, 1940, exactly 30 minutes before the deadline. Carl Probst was paid $200 for his work. He never received official credit during his lifetime. The Willis Quad prototype followed on November 11, 1940. The Ford Pygmy arrived on November 23. What happened next became one of the war's bitterest industrial controversies. During Bantam's testing at Camp Holabird, Ford and Willis representatives were invited to observe. They were given access to Bantam's technical drawings, which were government property. Both companies incorporated Bantam's innovations into their own designs. In 1943 and again in 1948, the Federal Trade Commission ruled that Bantam had originated and developed the Jeep concept. They ordered Willis to stop claiming sole credit. In 2015, the Pennsylvania General Assembly unanimously resolved that Bantam invented the Jeep. But Willis Overland won the standardization contract in July 1941 for 3 decisive reasons. First, their engine was far more powerful. Chief Engineer Delmar Roos, known as Barney, had transformed an aging 4-cylinder engine into a powerhouse. The original design dated from a 1926 Whippet and lasted only 22 hours at full throttle. Roos redesigned it with insert bearings, a counterweight crankshaft, lightweight aluminum pistons, full-pressure lubrication, and revised breathing. The result ran 100 hours on the dynamometer at full output. It produced 60 horsepower, nearly triple what Ford's engine delivered. Second, Willis submitted the lowest bid at $748.74 per unit. Third, the vehicle had the lowest silhouette, which the Army favored for concealment. The redesigned engine became known as the Go Devil. The vehicle became the Willis MB. Ford was licensed to produce copies using Willis blueprints and the Go Devil engine. Ford's designation GPW stood for G meaning government, P meaning 80 inches wheelbase, and W meaning Willis licensed design. It did not stand for general purpose as many people believe. Bantam built approximately 2,600 Jeeps before losing their contracts. Most were shipped to British and Soviet forces under Lend-Lease. The company that invented the Jeep received almost nothing for its creation, but its design would have an unexpected legacy. When the Japanese Imperial Army invaded the Philippines, they discovered a Bantam reconnaissance car and sent it to Japan for study. Toyota was ordered to reverse engineer the vehicle, producing a wartime prototype. Though that initial effort saw limited success, the lessons learned during its development influenced Toyota's post-war designs, contributing to the eventual creation of the Toyota Land Cruiser in the 1950s. The origin of the name Jeep remains debated. Some believe it came from slurring the letters GP. Others point to Eugene the Jeep, a magical creature from the Popeye comic strip that could go anywhere and do anything. The character first appeared on March 16, 1936. Military slang of the era also used Jeep as a term for untested vehicles. The first known published use of the name appeared in the Washington Daily News in June 1941. The Go Devil engine and the vehicle it powered were engineered for one purpose: to go anywhere, carry anything, and survive everything. The engine displaced 134.2 cu in. It produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute and 105 lb-ft of torque at 2,000 revolutions per minute. The 3-speed manual transmission connected to a 2-speed transfer case, providing high and low range. Part-time 4-wheel drive could be engaged through the transfer case. Top speed reached 65 miles per hour in high range. The vehicle measured 132 1/4 in long, 62 in wide with an 80 inches wheelbase. Curb weight was 2,453 pounds. With the windshield and canvas top folded down, height dropped to just 52 in, low enough to hide behind a stone wall. Payload capacity was 800 pounds cross-country. Maximum towed load reached 1,000 pounds. The Jeep's defining feature was its off-road capability. Ground clearance of 8 3/4 in, an approach angle of 45 degrees, a departure angle of 35 degrees, and a fording depth of 21 in without special equipment allowed it to traverse terrain that stopped every other wheeled vehicle in every Army's inventory. The turning circle was just 17.5 feet. A 15-gallon fuel tank provided a range of 200 to 300 miles depending on conditions. Compare this to the German Kübelwagen. The Kübelwagen was lighter at 1,597 pounds. It had better fuel economy at roughly 30 miles per gallon. Its air-cooled engine eliminated radiator vulnerability, but with only 25 horsepower versus 60, it could not tow artillery, serve as an ambulance, mount heavy weapons, or perform dozens of utility roles the Jeep filled. Its rear-wheel drive was a genuine handicap in deep mud, steep inclines, and heavy snow. Two contradictory official American evaluations exist. When the Army tested captured Kübelwagens at Aberdeen Proving Ground in November 1943, the evaluation concluded it was simpler, easier to manufacture and maintain, faster, and more comfortable for 4 passengers than the Jeep. However, the 1945 Handbook on German Military Forces stated flatly that the Volkswagen was inferior to the Jeep in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. The contradiction likely reflects different evaluation criteria: automotive qualities versus overall military utility. The Jeep's first major combat proving ground was North Africa. British Special Air Service units received their first consignment of 12 brand-new American Jeeps in June 1942, and the vehicle transformed special operations warfare overnight. SAS Jeeps were stripped and rebuilt for deep penetration rating. Windscreens were removed to reduce glint and improve firing arcs. Each vehicle mounted 4 Vickers K machine guns, rapid-firing aircraft weapons in twin mounts fore and aft. Some carried .50 caliber Browning M2s for heavier firepower. Jerry cans were strapped to every available surface. Sun compasses replaced magnetic ones, which were unreliable in the featureless desert. The raid on Sidi Hainish Airfield on the night of July 26 to 27, 1942 demonstrated what the Jeep made possible. David Stirling led 18 Jeeps in 2 columns of 9, each carrying 3 to 4 British or French commandos. They drove 50 miles from a hideout without headlights under a full moon. When runway lights switched on for a German bomber to land, Stirling fired his green flare. The Jeeps charged the airfield in V formation. Vickers K guns loaded with tracer ammunition raked parked aircraft. Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, Ju-52 transports, and Messerschmitt Bf-109s erupted in flames. 37 Axis aircraft were destroyed or damaged. 3 Jeeps were lost in the engagement. In the 15 months before Stirling's capture in January 1943, the SAS destroyed over 250 aircraft on the ground, dozens of supply dumps, railways, and telecommunications networks. Much of this destruction came from Jeep-mounted raids. Erwin Rommel nicknamed Sterling the Phantom Major and placed a bounty of 100,000 Reichsmarks on his head. For American forces, jeeps arrived in quantity during Operation Torch on November 8, 1942. The Go Devil's water-cooled engine was susceptible to overheating in extreme desert heat, and radiators clogged with fine sand. But the Jeep's four-wheel drive consistently outperformed two-wheel drive German vehicles in soft sand, and its towing capability made it indispensable for moving anti-tank guns forward. In March 1943, the Long-Range Desert Group used jeeps to navigate a route through the desert for the British 8th Army to outflank German positions at Mareth. This was a decisive maneuver in the final Allied advance to victory in North Africa. The European theater brought new challenges. D-Day on June 6, 1944 saw jeeps arrive on the Normandy beaches from the first hours. They were delivered by landing ship tanks, landing craft tanks, and behind enemy lines by Waco CG-4A and airspeed Horsa gliders that delivered jeeps to airborne divisions. A comprehensive deep-water fording kit sealed electrical connections with asbestos waterproofing compound, extended air intakes and exhaust pipes, and allowed jeeps to operate in water up to 4.5 feet deep for 8 minutes. This was enough time to drive off a landing craft through the surf. Ordnance Division Officer Jack Nerov stepped onto his landing craft on June 5 with his soldiers, a jeep, and a small tractor. He arrived at Omaha Beach at approximately 6:30 in the morning on June 6, going in with elements of the 29th Infantry Division. In the Norman bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy, the jeep faced lethal dangers. Germans strung piano wire between trees at throat height to decapitate jeep occupants at speed. The countermeasure was stark. Soldiers bolted vertical iron bars to the front bumper with a notch at the top to catch and sever the wires. Jeeps were confined to narrow lanes, easily covered by German machine guns. At almost every bend of the road, they were fired upon, one veteran recalled. But their small size, four-wheel drive, and versatility as ambulances, command vehicles, and supply runners kept them indispensable until Operation Cobra's breakout in late July. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the bold Allied attempt to secure key bridges in the Netherlands, the jeep proved vital once again. Its off-road capabilities allowed it to navigate challenging terrain, enabling rapid troop transport and logistical support for approximately 85,000 Allied forces involved in the combined airborne and ground operation. Even under heavy resistance, the jeep excelled in moving equipment and evacuating wounded soldiers. The Battle of the Bulge produced the war's most dramatic jeep episode. On October 22, 1944, Adolf Hitler ordered SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny to form Panzer Brigade 150. German soldiers would wear American uniforms and drive captured American vehicles to sow chaos behind Allied lines during the coming Ardennes offensive. Skorzeny requested 100 jeeps. He received only 30. This revealed both how desperately the Germans valued the vehicle and how few captures they could scrape together across all occupied territory. The best English speakers were organized into Einheitsstilau, small teams of 2 to 6 men in captured jeeps. They were trained in American customs, including eating with a fork after laying down the knife and tapping cigarettes the American way. About 28 men successfully penetrated American lines beginning December 16, 1944. They created psychological disruption vastly disproportionate to their numbers. They reversed road signs, cut phone lines, and sent entire Allied regiments in wrong directions. Detection came through cultural knowledge gaps. One team asked for petrol instead of gas and was immediately captured. Another claimed membership in E Company, 14th Cavalry. Americans' new cavalry was organized into troops, not companies. That team was killed. On December 17th, military police captured 3 commandos named Peruz, Billing, and Schmidt at a bridge checkpoint near Awale in Belgium. Under interrogation, Schmidt claimed that Skorzeny planned to assassinate Eisenhower. This triggered a massive security lockdown at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Paris. Eisenhower was confined over Christmas. General Omar Bradley was briefly detained when he correctly answered Springfield as the capital of Illinois. The questioning soldier wrongly believed it was Chicago. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had his jeep's tires shot out by overly zealous American sentries. Those German commandos captured in American uniforms were executed by firing squad as spies. The first 3 were executed on December 23, 1944. 17 total were executed during and after the campaign. The Jeep accompanied the liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944. General Jacques-Philippe Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division paraded down the Champs-Élysées on tanks and jeeps. During the Rhine crossing in March 1945, Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne lift in the war, delivered jeeps by glider across the river to support airborne troops. In Italy, the Jeep proved essential on mountain roads, though terrain above the valleys of Monte Cassino was beyond even its capabilities. There, only mules could deliver supplies. At Anzio, advanced Jeep patrols reached the outskirts of Rome before General John Lucas' cautious consolidation halted the advance. A Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps ambulance jeep was photographed on the Moro River front near San Leonardo di Ortona on December 10, 1943. This was one of the earliest documented jeep ambulance uses in the Italian campaign. The Pacific Theater presented entirely different challenges. Volcanic sand, sharp coral, tropical humidity, dense jungle, and tiny islands where every supply item had to come by sea. The jeep's compact dimensions, just 11 feet long and 4 feet high, were a critical advantage. It fit onto smaller vessels and navigated terrain where Sherman tanks could not go. Its lightweight design allowed it to traverse dense jungle with 9 inches of ground clearance. Nearly 50% of jeeps in the Pacific provided essential supply chain and medical evacuation support. The first jeeps in the Philippines arrived months before Pearl Harbor. These were not Willis MBs or Ford GPWs, but the rare Bantam BRC, Ford GP, and Willis MA models. On April 9, 1942, jeeps from the 192nd Tank Battalion played a somber role in history. With white flags made from company bedding mounted on their hoods, they carried General Edward King's staff officers to negotiate the American surrender at Bataan. Corporal William Burns of Company A drove one of the 2 surrender jeeps. Approximately 75,000 American and Filipino troops would become prisoners that day. When American forces returned in early February 1945, the chaotic traffic situation in Manila was managed by U.S. Army traffic control groups using jeeps. The Provost Marshal's office faced 2 problems. One was enforcement of traffic rules during the conversion to driving on the right side of the road. The second was the burgeoning black market in stolen jeeps and trucks on Guadalcanal from August 1942 to February 1943. Among the first major Pacific Jeep deployments, vehicles struggled through swamps and jungle with the 1st Marine Division. One Willis MB called Old Faithful was reportedly the first Marine Jeep to land on Guadalcanal. It received 2 shrapnel holes in its windshield during Japanese battleship shelling on October 13, 1942. Its Marine occupants symbolically awarded it an honorary Purple Heart, a gesture of affection rather than an official military decoration. Over 18 months, Old Faithful served as command car for 4 Marine generals. It carried Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. It carried Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral William Halsey. It traveled more than 11,000 miles of jungle terrain before being retired by official Marine Corps order on December 22, 1943. It was the first American vehicle ever symbolically decorated with a Purple Heart and spent the rest of the war on display during Bond tours. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, the volcanic ash terrain bogged jeeps down despite tire chains. Photographs from the National Museum of the Pacific War show jeeps sunk to their axles, their tire chain covers unable to prevent the wheels from sinking into the sand. Battle-scarred Holden ambulance jeeps with canvas ripped and sagging, windshield glazing gone, fenders battered, and shrapnel holes in their hoods evacuated casualties from Mount Suribachi's slopes to beach aid stations. On Okinawa, from April to June 1945, the Jeep ambulance roll reached its peak. Corpsmen held plasma bottles while riding beside wounded men on ambulance jeeps across the island's mountainous terrain. In the China-Burma-India theater, jeeps traveled the Stillwell Road, the 1,079-mile replacement for the severed Burma Road. The first convoy of 113 vehicles departed Lido on January 12, 1945, reaching Kunming on February 4. Merrill's Marauders and Chindit long-range penetration. Groups used jeeps extensively in the Burmese jungle. The Pacific drove specialized modifications. The Willys MLW Jungle Jeep series featured a stretched wheelbase and 7.50 by 20 tractor profile tires designed specifically for mud and swamp. Jeeps were fitted with flanged steel wheels to run on captured narrow-gauge railroad tracks. This was a particularly popular modification in Burma. Deep-water fording kits with extended exhaust snorkels became standard for amphibious landings. In 1942, Pearl Harbor demonstrated that the war with Japan would involve operations at sea and across the islands of Southeast and East Asia. The military needed amphibious vehicles. Ford collaborated with yacht builders Sparkman and Stevens to create an amphibious version of the Jeep. The result was the Ford GPA, nicknamed the Seep. Ford produced approximately 12,700 of these amphibious Jeeps during the war. The design was created in perhaps too much of a hurry given wartime pressures, and it suffered from reliability issues, but it filled a critical gap in amphibious capability. Approximately 50,000 to 52,000 Jeeps were shipped to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. The figure of 51,503 appears in the most detailed source breakdowns, though records show only 39,800 received. The discrepancy likely reflects transit losses from U-boat attacks. Deliveries traveled 3 routes. The deadly Arctic convoys went to Murmansk and Archangel. The safer Persian corridor went through Iran. The Pacific route via Vladivostok carried 50% of all Lend-Lease tonnage. Initial shipments in spring and summer of 1942 included older Bantam BRC-40, Ford GP, and Willys MA models. Mass Willys MB deliveries began in mid-1942, with 85% of all Lend-Lease supplies arriving after early 1943. Soviet soldiers universally called both Willys MBs and Ford GPWs simply Willys. They pronounced it Vilis. According to the daughter of the Willys Overland chairman, Soviet reception was overwhelmingly positive. At the Kubinka Proving Ground in May and June of 1943, comparative tests of the Willys MB, Ford GPW, and domestic JZ-64 found the American vehicle had better hydraulics, easier handling, and greater comfort. The Jeep directly inspired the Soviet JZ-67 program, which was essentially a reverse engineering effort. The JZ-67 was heavier at 2,900 pounds versus the Jeep's 2,453. It had weaker brakes, harder steering, and higher fuel consumption. Soviet soldiers nicknamed it Ivan Willys, explicitly acknowledging its American parentage. Only 4,851 JZ-67s were built during the war, compared to over 50,000 Lend-Lease Jeeps received. At the September 1941 Moscow conference, when American diplomat Averell Harriman reached 5,000 Jeeps on his supply list, Stalin's eyes lit up. It was his first positive reaction in what had been a hostile meeting. Correspondent Henry Cassidy cabled from the Russian front that the American Jeep had met the Russian mud and the situation was well in hand. On the Eastern Front, the Willys MB proved critical to maintaining a viable command structure between frontline troops and officers. Over 50,000 units provided essential mobility and logistical support during critical battles like Stalingrad and Kursk. Its rugged design, lightweight construction, and off-road capabilities allowed Soviet forces to traverse treacherous landscapes where traditional vehicles faltered. The most important Soviet testimony comes from Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs published posthumously in 1970. Khrushchev recounted Stalin's private assessment of Lend-Lease aid overall. If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have stood up against Germany's pressure, and we would have lost the war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, secretly recorded by the KGB in 1963, was equally direct. One cannot deny that the Americans shipped over to us material without which we could not have equipped our armies held in reserve or been able to continue the war. Stalin himself told Winston Churchill at the Tehran Conference on November 30, 1943 that without the machines received through Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union would lose the war. Cold War Soviet historiography systematically downplayed these assessments. Politburo member Nikolai Voznesensky claimed in 1948 that Lend-Lease amounted to only 4.8% of Soviet wartime production. Western historians consider this figure misleading as it likely excluded the much larger 1944 to 1945 shipments. The Jeep's official designation was truck, quarter-ton, 4x4, command reconnaissance. This barely hints at its actual versatility. The vehicle filled dozens of roles its designers never imagined. No factory ambulance variant existed. Field adaptations carried 2-liter patients plus a driver and assistant. The Holden Jeep ambulance was designed by Lieutenant Commander French Moore, a battalion surgeon with the 2nd Marine Division at Camp Elliott, California in 1942. He submitted blueprints and records of performance to Marine Corps Commandant Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb. The prototype could carry up to 35 patients 1,000 yards and return in an hour through repeated trips. Built by General Motors Holden in Melbourne, it featured pipe and angle iron framework, canvas enclosure, and stretcher racks. Between 500 and 800 were produced. It was approved for fielding in time for the Solomon Islands campaign in 1943. During the Battle of Anzio in 1944, Jeep ambulances suffered up to 12 tire punctures per day from street debris. The 1st Infantry Division's after-action report confirmed they had a definite advantage in motor evacuation of litter patients. The standard pintle mount held .30 caliber or .50 caliber machine guns capable of near vertical elevation for anti-aircraft fire. SAS Jeeps carried for Vickers guns. The M6 37mm gun motor carriage was a factory-produced variant mounting the 37mm anti-tank gun and .50 caliber machine gun in the Jeep bed. Twin bazooka mountings provided additional anti-tank capability. The Jeep towed the M337mm anti-tank gun weighing 912 pounds and the 75mm M1A1 pack howitzer. An average of 145 Jeeps per infantry regiment provided organic mobility for light artillery. The Jeep served as command vehicle for Eisenhower, George Patton, Douglas MacArthur, Omar Bradley, and Bernard Montgomery. Patton's personal Jeep featured a large red leather seat and 2 brass horns mounted on the hood. Jeeps carried SCR 510, SCR 610, SCR 284, and SCR 506 radio sets, serving as mobile command posts from company to regimental level. A November 1942 Popular Mechanics report described 3 Jeeps in Australia completing a cable-laying job in 2 hours that would have taken days by hand. Jeeps ran on flanged wheels for railroad patrol. They used ski attachments for snow operations. They powered sawmills and generators via power takeoff. Soldiers heated C-ration cans on the engine manifold and drained radiator water for hot shaving water. War correspondent Ernie Pyle reached 700 newspapers with his syndicated column. He wrote from North Africa on June 4, 1943. And the Jeep, good Lord, I do not think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It is as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. Constantly carries twice what it was designed for, and still keeps on going. Pyle called it a divine instrument of military locomotion. He was killed on April 18, 1945 on Ie Shima while traveling by Jeep when it came under Japanese machine gun fire. Eisenhower wrote in Crusade in Europe in 1948 that 4 pieces of equipment became regarded as among the most vital to success in Africa and Europe. These were the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 airplane. He noted that, curiously enough, none of these was designed for combat. Bill Mauldin was a 23-year-old soldier cartoonist who won the 1945 Pulitzer Prize for his Willie and Joe cartoons in Stars and Stripes. He made the Jeep a central character of his war art. His self-described favorite cartoon shows a grief-stricken cavalry sergeant covering his eyes as he points his pistol at the radiator of his broken-down Jeep, just as he would put down a horse with a broken leg. The image became one of the war's most iconic representations of the bond between soldiers and their vehicles. Mauldin named his own Jeep Genie and was given his own vehicle to roam the front collecting material. General Patton despised Mauldin's cartoons for depicting soldiers as scruffy and demoralized. Eisenhower and General Mark Clark overruled Patton's attempts to suppress them. Willis produced approximately 361,000 megabytes Jeeps. Ford produced approximately 277,896 GPWs. Ford also produced approximately 12,700 amphibious GPA Jeeps. Combined with early Ford G-Piece and Bantam BRC-40s, the total reached approximately 647,000 vehicles. The cost per unit on the first contract was $748.74. At peak production, American factories completed one Jeep every 90 seconds. The Jeep's post-war transformation began before the war even ended. On July 17, 1945, Willis Overland started producing the CJ-2A, the civilian Jeep. It was the world's first mass-produced civilian four-wheel-drive vehicle. Marketed as the all-around farm workhorse, it targeted America's 5.5 million farmers, of whom 4 million had neither a truck nor a tractor. Between 1945 and 1949, 214,760 CJ-2As were sold. The civilian version featured a 7-slot grille. Willis could not use the military 9-slot design because Ford owned the rights. This design element persists on Jeep vehicles to this day. The Jeep's most profound legacy may be the vehicles it inspired. Maurice Wilkes, engineering director at Rover, used a surplus Willis Jeep on his Welsh farm after the war. When his brother Spencer asked what he would do when it wore out, Maurice replied that he supposed he would buy another one because there was not anything else. He sketched the basic Land Rover design in the sand at Red Wharf Bay on Anglesey in 1947. The first prototype was built on a Jeep chassis using Jeep axles. The Soviet JZ-69, Nissan Patrol, and India's Mahindra vehicles all trace their lineage to the wartime influence of the Willis MB. The American Enterprise Institute called it one of the most influential designs in automotive history. The New York Museum of Modern Art includes a military Jeep in its display of 8 automobiles, regarding it as one of the very few genuine expressions of machine art. Although the Willis Jeep was not the first four-wheel drive vehicle ever built, it influenced every 4x4 constructed in its wake. The vehicle that emerged from the cauldron of war was ready for peacetime service. The legendary workhorse of the war was converted by Willis Overland into a civilian Jeep with the aim of putting farm workhorses out to pasture. What began as a desperate military requirement became a revolution in how the world moved. The Jeep brand passed from Willis Overland in 1941 to Kaiser in 1953, to American Motors Corporation in 1970, to Chrysler in 1987, and on to today's Stellantis. The Jeep was described as the big draw in Chrysler's $1.5 billion acquisition of American Motors Corporation. In the Philippines, the Jeep became something even more. Surplus military Jeeps were converted into the jeepney, an iconic mode of public transportation that remains the country's symbol to this day. Filipinos coined a method of naming each Jeep model. The Ford GPW and Willis MB were termed MacArthur Jeeps. The M38A1 was called the Eisenhower Jeep. The M151 became known as the Kennedy Jeep. Interest among Jeep enthusiasts in the Philippines remains strong, with restorers going to the provinces hoping to find that elusive Jeep in a barn. Preserved Jeeps stand in museums worldwide. The Smithsonian holds Bantam prototype serial number 10007. Heritage Museums and Gardens in Sandwich, Massachusetts displays a 1942 Willis MB equipped with wire cutter, field radio, and desert cooling kit. Butler, Pennsylvania, where Carl Probst drew his blueprints in a near-empty factory, hosts the annual Bantam Jeep Heritage Festival, the largest Jeep festival in America. A historical marker erected in 1993 commemorates the birthplace. In 1991, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated the MB Jeep as International Historic Mechanical Engineering Landmark number 152. The Willis MB was not the most powerful vehicle of the war. It was not the most comfortable. It was not the most technologically sophisticated. The Kübelwagen was lighter and more fuel efficient. German half-tracks carried more armor and firepower, but no other vehicle in any army could do what the Jeep did. It filled every role on every battlefield in numbers that overwhelmed all opposition. Germany built beautiful machines in insufficient quantities with incompatible parts. Their Einheit standardization program failed. Their 100 different vehicle types created logistics chaos. Their horses still pulled supplies on the Eastern Front while American trucks delivered Lend-Lease aid to Soviet soldiers driving American Jeeps. The Wehrmacht employed an astounding 2,750,000 horses during the war, most of which had to be transported by rail to the combat zones. Fodder for these horses consumed space in rail cars that could have carried fuel and ammunition. Meanwhile, the Americans standardized around a handful of proven designs. The Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck that soldiers called the Deuce and a Half, and the C-47 transport aircraft. Parts were interchangeable. Mechanics trained on one vehicle could service any vehicle. Supply chains flowed smoothly because every unit needed the same components. America built one tough, versatile machine in numbers that buried the opposition. 647,000 Jeeps versus 50,000 Kübelwagens. 60 horsepower versus 25. Four-wheel drive versus 2. 100 different German vehicle types versus American standardization around a handful of designs. The Jeep story is ultimately about more than automotive engineering. It is about the difference between specialized excellence and adaptable mass production. It is about the industrial capacity that translated raw resources into battlefield dominance. It is about a vehicle created under impossible deadlines by a freelance engineer, paid $200, refined by an engine designer who turned a failing motor into a workhorse, and manufactured in quantities that put identical interchangeable vehicles into the hands of soldiers from the Solomon Islands to the frozen approaches of Moscow. When Karl Probst sat down in that empty drafting room in Butler, Pennsylvania in July of 1940, he could not have known what he was creating. When Barney Roos redesigned the Godevil engine to run 100 hours at full power, he could not have foreseen SAS commandos destroying aircraft across North Africa. When the first Jeeps rolled off the production line in November 1941, 19 days before Pearl Harbor, no one imagined Soviet soldiers calling them Willis on the road to Berlin. The Jeep did what no German vehicle could because it was designed to do everything adequately rather than one thing perfectly. Carried wounded men to aid stations. It towed artillery into position. It ran telephone wire across battlefields. It served as a mobile command post for the generals who planned the liberation of Europe. It drove through the surf at Normandy, across the sands of Egypt, through the jungles of Burma, and into the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. The original Jeep continued to serve after the war in Korea and other conflicts until it was updated in the form of the M38 Willis MC in 1950 and the M38A1 Willis MD in 1952. It received a complete redesign by Ford in the form of the M151 introduced in 1960. But the spirit of that original quarter-ton reconnaissance car lived on in every generation that followed. Today, more than 8 decades after Karl Probst's weekend of desperate drafting, the vehicles that fill highways around the world owe their existence to his creation. Every sport utility vehicle, every four-wheel drive truck, every off-road vehicle traces its lineage back to a quarter-ton reconnaissance car built to meet an impossible deadline. The Jeep changed how wars are fought, how farms are worked, and how people explore the wild places of the earth. That is the legacy of the American Jeep. Not the power of its engine or the strength of its axles, but the simple truth that one versatile machine produced in overwhelming numbers could do what all the specialized excellence of German engineering could not. Could be everywhere, do everything, and keep going no matter what the battlefield demanded. The generals understood this. Eisenhower ranked the Jeep alongside the C-47 as essential to victory. Marshall called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. Stalin's eyes lit up when Harriman mentioned 5,000 Jeeps. Khrushchev admitted the Soviet Union might have lost without American aid. Even the enemy paid tribute by trying desperately to capture enough Jeeps for Operation Greif and receiving only 30. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, from the volcanic islands of the Pacific to the muddy roads of the Eastern Front, the American Jeep proved that in modern warfare victory belongs not to the country that builds the most sophisticated weapons, but to the country that can put adequate weapons into every soldier's hands. Germany's 100 vehicle types could not match America's one. The Kübelwagen's clever engineering could not overcome the Jeep's brute production numbers. Specialized excellence fell before democratic industrial power. That is the story of how the American Jeep did what no German vehicle could in every theater of the Second World War. It is a story worth remembering because it tells us something important about how wars are won and lost. Not always by the most advanced technology or the most brilliant engineering, but often by the country that can build enough of what its soldiers need and get it to them wherever they are fighting. The Jeep was that something. It was everywhere. It did everything, and in the end it helped win a war.